It was at this very moment, with Germany in yet another political stalemate, that Hitler was saved from obscurity by events over which he had little control. There are two common misconceptions about how Hitler first came to power. One, that he seized power through a military coup, a putsch in German, and two, that he was elected by the German public. Both are incorrect. In fact, Hitler's power was handed to him by conniving politicians who thought they could control him and use him to further their own ambitions. The man most responsible for Hitler's good fortune was Franz von Papen, the former Chancellor of Germany. At the beginning of 1933, he'd recently been replaced in office by a fierce political rival, the Minister of Defense, General Kurt von Schleicher. Deeply embittered by his sudden removal, Papen was determined to get even with Schleicher and get back in power. And so he made a deal with Hitler. He set out to convince President Hindenburg to appoint Hitler Chancellor. Papen would be Vice-Chancellor. He told President Hindenburg that Hitler, weakened by his failure in the last election, could be tamed, especially if he was surrounded by responsible politicians like Papen. Papen even said, "Don't worry, we've hired him." After a series of lies and deceptions designed to overcome Hindenburg's deep misgivings, the president finally agreed.
And so on January 30th, in what must be one of history's bitterest ironies, that at a moment when the Nazi constituency seemed to be unraveling, Hitler is appointed chancellor.
That night, the Nazis staged a massive demonstration in Berlin. Hitler and Hindenburg waving from separate windows to the cheering crowds below. For Hitler, this was only the first step. His ultimate goal was absolute power. When Hitler took over as chancellor, he faced the same problems as his predecessors. He had no majority in parliament, and he had to stay in the good graces of the president, the only man who could remove him. This was not the absolute power Hitler had in mind. But quite quickly, a spectacular event helped him. A month after becoming chancellor, the Reichstag, the German parliament building, was set on fire. A former communist was arrested and put on trial, but for Hitler, the fire was a timely stroke of luck. It gave him an excuse for a brutal crackdown against his opposition on the left, the likes of which Germany had never seen.
They arrested the communists, they harassed and censored political parties, particularly the Social Democratic Party, the moderate socialists.
In addition, Hitler deputized the stormtroopers. They are now the police. It was the day they had been waiting for. They arrested so many people that the jails overflowed and they had to create a new institution. It was called the Konzentrationslager, the concentration camp.
They just round up leaders of the Social Democratic and Communist Party, drag them down to one of these concentration camps or torture cellars, take them there, beat them, in some cases murder them.
If husbands went into exile, the Nazis would arrest the wives and children and throw them into concentration camps. The terror, the reprisals were instant.
And as long as it's directed against the left, it's condoned and tolerated by large elements of the middle class.
On March the 21st, the reopening of Parliament provided a propaganda opportunity to recast the Nazi Party's image of brutality and radicalism. To create the illusion of continuity between the old and new regimes, Hitler chose the Garrison Church for the ceremony, the great shrine of Imperial Germany, where Kaiser Wilhelm held court and Frederick the Great was buried.
This day was a carefully orchestrated event by the Nazis aimed at reassuring conservative Germans and President Hindenburg that Hitler was not some wild-eyed radical who's going to turn the country over to the stormtroopers.
It did bother some of Hitler's more radical supporters. They had some worries about the alacrity with which Hitler seemed to be joining with Hindenburg. But generally, this day played very well.
That was the turning point in public opinion. Movies were taken and fed directly into the newsreels, and it looked as if Hitler, dressed in civilian clothes very, very properly, had been tamed after all. Suddenly, it was respectable to support the Nazis.
The charade of a tamed Hitler was exactly that, revealed by his plan to push through something called an enabling law, which would enable Hitler to rule by decree. He needed a two-thirds majority to get the enabling law passed. On the day of the vote, he left little to chance.
This meeting took place in a sea of stormtroopers. Stormtrooper units surrounded the Parliament building. They were inside. Some of them were, of course, members of the Parliament. And they made it very clear as other deputies came in that if they didn't vote for the Enabling Act, they may not go home that night.
As Hitler enters the chamber there was no doubt whatsoever of the need to impress a sense of fear and menace in the opposition on that day. And indeed, the opposition had been reduced, in effect, to the Social Democrats.
There's one capitulation that's particularly noteworthy. The representatives who had been elected by Catholic voters capitulated and signed on to Hitler's power. And so, in other words, the leaders of the political party did what the voters had refused to do, and that is to agree to Hitler becoming dictator.
The die was now cast, the Enabling Act passed by a huge majority, and that, of course, then set this dictatorship on its course.
By 1933, the Nazification of Germany, the reordering of German society under Hitler, took many forms.
At every level, an entire panoply of social clubs in almost every small town and village in Germany Nazified itself. Skittle clubs, gardening associations, singing clubs.
Hitler's portrait was to be found everywhere. His face was at the bottom of bowls, on cups, streets named after him, kids were named after him.
So there's an enormous set of impulses released from below here without all the time directives from above. Hitler does very little in these months in terms of any directives to coordinate these groupings.
One really good example of local initiatives is the book burnings in Berlin in May 1933, organized by university students acting on their own initiative, were not organized from above.
Leading German authors, Nobel Prize winners and so on, found their works then thrown on these bonfires, which were rising up outside the buildings of all Germany's major universities. Initiatives taken by the students and by their professors.
But despite the seemingly unstoppable wave of popular support, one last obstacle to total power for Hitler remained. President Hindenburg and the German Army Command were increasingly concerned that the Nazi Party was out of control.
The Army still remained a very real threat to Nazi power. If the Army grew disaffected, if Hindenburg woke up one morning and decided this had all been a mistake and sent for a military attaché, who knew what could happen?
Their main concern was the stormtroopers. They'd grown to vast proportions and were now demanding their share of the spoils.
They've brought Hitler to power. What are they going to get in return? And by the summer of 1933, they really didn't have a purpose, because once they had been used to suppress the left, really their function was done as far as Hitler was concerned.
So as time went on, Hitler was faced with the dilemma that the stormtroopers, who by this time are acting as political hooligans, were causing a lot of trouble now with the army leadership. The army is increasingly worried about the threat of the stormtroopers to supplant its own position. And Hitler is being put on the spot of having to choose between the army and the stormtroopers.
Ernst Röhm, who still commanded the stormtroopers, had become a real threat to the German High Command.
Röhm now begins to call for the stormtroopers to be merged with the military. He wants to create a people's army, a revolutionary national socialist army.
But the Minister of Defense, General Werner von Blomberg, was well aware of Röhm's ambitions.
General Blomberg was quite concerned about Röhm and the stormtroopers. They'd served their purpose. They'd fulfilled their mission. And Röhm didn't seem to understand this. All of this incautious talk about absorbing the army and becoming a people's army and so on was not what Hitler wanted to hear, not what Blomberg wanted to hear.
Determined to avoid a confrontation and desperate to regain control, Hitler called the stormtroopers to a mass meeting.
Ich weiß es, meine Kameraden, es ist euch wohl oft schwer gefallen, wenn ihr meintet, es müsse nun ein Wandel kommen und erklärt, es geht nicht, ihr dürft nicht handeln, ihr müsst gehorchen, ihr müsst euch fügen, ihr müsst euch diesem unerhörten Zwang beugen.
Despite Hitler's pleas, the conflict between the stormtroopers and the army was becoming a crisis. Adding to the urgency was the failing health of President Hindenburg.
Hindenburg was now seriously ill and unlikely to recover, and if the army didn't support Hitler as the head of state, Hitler would have been in a very difficult position indeed.
With the army, if the army could be brought on board, then total power would be in Hitler's hands.
So Hitler made his deal with the army. Blomberg agreed to support Hitler taking presidential powers when Hindenburg died if Hitler would deal with the stormtroopers' leader, Röhm.
But in the case of Ernst Röhm, he was dealing with one of his oldest co-fighters. He'd known Röhm since 1919. Röhm had been very influential in helping Hitler in the early years in Munich. And Hitler did have this streak in him, which was one of some loyalty towards people who had, in his view, done him a great service in the past.
It's a hard dilemma for him. He'd been friends with Röhm since the beginning, and Röhm was one of the few people that Hitler talked to using the intimate form, the du form of address. But the precipitating event for Hitler to take action was that Hindenburg was going to die.
On June the 21st, 1934, Hitler went to visit the dying Hindenburg at his country estate.
And who should he meet there but Defense Minister Blomberg, who's just come away from seeing the ailing president, and Blomberg tells Hitler in no uncertain terms that he needs to act now against the stormtroopers.
The military is willing to do its part if Hitler will do his part. And Hitler decides to do his part in late June.
On June the 30th at 2 a.m., Hitler boarded a plane for Bavaria. He had called a meeting of the stormtrooper leadership to be held at a resort just outside Munich. Hitler arrived at dawn and was driven to the hotel where Röhm and the others were sound asleep, utterly unprepared for what was about to happen. Hitler stormed up the stairs with his pistol drawn. He burst in on Röhm and arrested him as the secret police stalked the halls, breaking through doors and yanking the stormtrooper leaders from their beds. They were all taken to Stadelheim prison in Munich. There, the murders began. Most of them were shot within hours. But on Hitler's orders, Röhm was given a choice. He was handed a gun. He could take his own life. He declined. So standing in his cell, he was shot in the head. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the SS rounded up 150 other high-ranking stormtroopers and took them to the Lichterfeld Cadet School, where they were lined up against the wall and shot by a firing squad. This was only the beginning. Hitler had old scores to settle. When former Chancellor von Schleicher answered his door, he was met by a gunman. When his wife came running, she was murdered too. Gregor Strasser, the former head of Hitler's political operation, was dragged to the basement of Gestapo headquarters, where he was murdered. Fritz Gerlich, the Munich reporter already imprisoned at Dachau, was shot in the head and his blood-splattered glasses delivered to his widow. Even Gustav von Kahr, the former Bavarian commissar who wouldn't go ahead with the beer hall putsch 11 years earlier, was remembered that day by Hitler as a traitor. He was found hacked to death in a ditch. The killings continued through the following afternoon as Hitler gave a tea party in the Chancellery Gardens.
Just about a month later, on August 2nd, Reich President Hindenburg died. And on that day, indeed, that very same day, the Army now let the other shoe drop. It now came the payment. The Army swore personal allegiance, not to the German Constitution, not to the German people, not to the German state, but to the person of Adolf Hitler. The last obstacle to total power in Germany had been eliminated.
Adolf Hitler!